Welcome to session 2 of our study of ideas that formed us. We'll have a word of prayer and get started. Thank you, Lord, for the opportunity to share your wisdom and the wisdom that you imparted to man, and also some of the silly things that you have imparted to man as well. And we'll go through some of those as we go forward. Thank you for the interest that we have, and help us to impart something tonight that will enlighten those who have joined us. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, last week we talked about Thales as the father of Western philosophy, and I may have left you feeling that Thales was kind of a small mind because he thought water was the ultimate reality. But I did mention to you that there are a couple of things of significance that he did, and I want to share one of them with you before we move forward. It's just kind of a piece of trivia, if you will. And it's something that you can actually test on your own to see just how smart Thales was. Thales was a traveler in a day when travel was common but was not very comfortable, to say the least. He traveled a lot, and he went to Egypt. And while he was in Egypt, he saw the Great Pyramids on the Giza Plateau, and in specific, he was interested in the Great Pyramid of Sephren, or some call it Cheops. He wanted to know how tall it was. And interestingly enough, he asked all the people that he mixed with in Egypt that were of similar intelligence, similar education, and none of them knew. In fact, they were as desirous, the Egyptians were, and other folks, were as desirous of knowing how tall the pyramids were as Thales was. Well, Thales conjured and thought and sat and thought and conjured and sat and thought about how he could determine this. Now, you have this pyramid sitting on the plateau, and he could not climb it to get a different viewpoint or vantage point, because at that time the pyramid was completely encased in a limestone covering with a gold cap on top of the pyramid. Now, that was since, you know what we have to see today. If you look in if you Google it and look at pictures, so forth, we have what we have today because later on, centuries later, they started to strip the limestone off to use in other building projects. But the limestone was then intact when Thales was there, so he could not get to the top of the pyramid to try other ways of measuring the height. What he came upon was the idea of placing a stick in the ground. Now, it had to be a straight stick, and it had to be plumb, had to be perpendicular, had to be on flat ground. But once he put the stick in that met all those criteria in the ground, he knew how tall the stick was. So let's say the stick was 5 feet overall, but 3 feet were protruding from the ground. So he next thought about using the pyramid's shadow to measure its height. But the problem was, when would he measure the shadow? Because at dawn, the shadow would be very long as the sun was just coming up, and as the day passed, at noon, of course, there would be no shadow, And then as the afternoon wore on, the shadow would again lengthen. So where was he to measure? That's where the idea of the stick came up. As the shadow passed over the stick, and the shadow was the same length as the height of the stick, if that were true, then it would be true of the pyramid as well. So what he did is, he had some help, I'm sure, as the shadow got to be the same as the height of the stick, he had someone run out and mark where the shadow was for the pyramid. And that was how he figured the height of the pyramid. And by the way, he was absolutely correct. Now, you can do the same thing in your yard or wherever, whatever kind of environment you're in, by measuring, say, a fence post or something like that. And as the sun cast a shadow the same height as the fence post, whatever you want to know the height of will be the same as the end of the shadow of the object you want to measure. So Thales was not the small-minded man that we may have thought him. Actually, he was quite brilliant for his day. Now, we're going to talk about a couple of other fellows that followed Thales, but also came before Socrates, or what we call, they are two more of the pre-Socratic philosophers. Now, I will remind you again that I am not giving you a philosophy class. That is not what I feel called to do, but I'm giving you a class on ideas, their development, and how they've come to impact us. So I'm going to leave out a lot of the philosophical terms and so forth, because they basically are the things that drive people crazy anyway. So I'm not going to worry about all that, but stick to the original plan. The first fellow we're going to talk about tonight is Heraclitus. Heraclitus is interesting because he's one of the fellows that really make people not want to discuss philosophical ideas. But remember, the point here with Thales being the father of Western philosophy is that men were finally looking to what they considered science at the time, and it was in a way, but observation and the understanding of those observations and the experiences that they were living, to come up with an answer rather than saying that Zeus caused the lightning or other gods and goddesses and so on and so forth. They were looking for the ultimate reality, remember. So that in itself was a major move forward. But Heraclitus used to summarize what his philosophy was, pantarei, the Greek phrase pantarei, which basically means all things are flowing. Or all things flow, depending on how you want to look at it. But he introduced a very important concept which has been argued for 2,500 years since he lived, and that is the difference between being and becoming. All things to him were in a state of becoming. And what just to give it to you in a different way or a conceptual way, Heraclitus said, you cannot step into the same river twice. And what he meant by that is that by the time you were to step your second foot into the river, all that water would have flown by and the river would be different. It would not be technically, or in his case, thinking really the same river. Sand would have moved. Pebbles would have moved. Some of the banks would have eroded, and the water would have rushed on. So things are in a constant state of flux, or all things are flowing. They're constantly changing, so they cannot be. Nevertheless, whatever changes is something. It cannot change without being. Heraclitus looked to fire as the basic element in things because it is constantly in flux. So unlike Thales, who had thought that the ultimate reality was water, Heraclitus believed the ultimate reality to be fire because it did meet this requirement. And fire must be constantly fed, yet it constantly gives off something. It gives off smoke, it gives off heat, it ultimately produces ashes. It is always in process, it's always being transformed into something else. For Heraclitus, the process of change is not chaotic, but is smooth and flowing and caused or orchestrated by God. Now, when Heraclitus mentioned God, he did not mean the Hebrew God. He did not mean a personal God, the type of God that you and I hopefully are familiar with or want to be familiar with today. But he looked at God as an impersonal being. Sort of like Star Wars, the Force. An impersonal being, a power, a driving force, that sort of thing. Not somebody that you could get to know and have a relationship with. Flux is the product of a universal reason that, that Heraclitus called logos. Logos. Now, some of you may be familiar with that term as some describe John's mention of Christ as the Word of God in John in his Gospel. They believe a synonym or translation is logos, but the logos that John uses, it would be a serious mistake to think of it being the same term that Heraclitus has used. They are not completely alike, but they are also not completely separate. Heraclitus basically was looking at a pre-existent eternal being or force. And that's what he meant by logos. And in some ways, based on our knowledge for those who are Christians, or even people that study the Bible, whether they be Christians or not, in some ways it is in common with John's use of the term in his gospel. Nevertheless, for him, the logos is the universal law that is immanent in all things. In the final analysis, the fire that he believed to be the ultimate reality was kind of with a capital F. like God rather than a small g, a capital G. But basically, what he was looking at or looking for, and I'm not going to do a lot of this, but it was kind of the originator of pantheism. Now, what is pantheism? Pantheism basically says that God is the universe, or the universe itself is a manifestation of God. Again, God not being a personal being, but God is the power behind everything. God is in everything. God moves everything. But he's not someone that's going to reveal himself to us in any other way than what we can see. His driving force, that things are in motion, that things are here. They are real, at least we believe they are. Heraclitus sought to account for the reality of strife, which he located in the conflict of opposites. Just as fire works through, the conflict of opposites where nothing is ever lost, but only changes form. Okay, the one thing to remember about Heraclitus is he said everything is in process of becoming, nothing is being. Okay? Now we're going to talk briefly about a gentleman that argued the point with him. Actually, he was a young contemporary of Heraclitus, and his name, some of you may have heard of him. Some of you that have been in some of my previous classes, now at least when I mess up on the board, you're laughing where I can't hear it. So thank you. And I'll warn you about the artwork that will be coming shortly. In any event, Parmenides, his best known saying was, whatever is, is. Now, like Thales, you may be wondering, how did Parmenides become famous for saying something like this? But I want you to realize that this statement, when viewed carefully, is actually what led me to stretch my brain to understand or try to consider or understand the things of God himself. Because what this statement means, if anything exists in an absolute way, it cannot change. So, as opposed to Heraclitus, who said nothing can be, everything is changing constantly, always, forever, Parmenides argued just the opposite. If something absolute exists, it cannot change. Thus, whatever is, is. And when he says is, it means in its state. Whatever that is. If it's a piece of ice, it's a piece of ice. Now, obviously, he knew that ice could melt, but it is. It's not becoming, it is. Because he argued that there's no way something can be constantly becoming, because for it to be doing anything, it has to be real. It has to be something. The idea that something could come out of nothing, and this is a phrase that some of you will be familiar with. ex nihilo nihilo fit, or some ex nihilo post nihilo. What that basically means is, very simply, from nothing, nothing comes. From nothing comes nothing, however you want to look at it. If something is nothing, example I use, I have nothing in this hand. I have nothing in this hand. If I put the two hands together and mash it all up, I still have nothing. Nothing produces nothing, so nothing can come from nothing. In other words, this is how Parmenides argued Heraclitus's point. If everything is becoming and never being, there would be nothing at all. Now these may seem like very simple concepts. You're going, oh, okay, wait a minute. After all this, what you're telling me is if things are becoming, they can't be, so therefore if nothing is, then there isn't anything. Why didn't you say that to start with? My point is this is how the ideas, the understanding developed. And believe it or not, in a week or two, you're going to see how in a major way our very thinking and living has incorporated these arguments about what is what. Okay? Change for Parmenides, as opposed to Heraclitus, change is an illusion. It's an illusion. The very concept of change to him was unimaginable. It was unthinkable. That is, we cannot really, we're going to go down in the alley a little bit here. We cannot really think of it. What he was saying is, I have my notes in front of me. These notes that I have written up over the years and have revised from time to time. I have my notes in front of me. Let's say that these notes were going to be in a different form, maybe even a different language or something, and I was to try to imagine that. I really cannot even imagine that change taking place. What I mean is this. Let's use the ladies for an example. This may not be a great example, but it's one that we can perhaps relate to because of some of the horrible stories that have come out in the news from plastic surgery. Let's say you want to have something done with your nose. And maybe you have had something done with your nose, but nevertheless, now let's take a more extreme example. Let's look at Bruce Jenner's transformation into Ms. Jenner. The whole time that was in his mind to go through with this, he could not truly imagine what he was going to be like or look like until it was actually done. That's what Parmenides is getting at here. We cannot think of change because it is not an it. Mr. Jenner was an it. And I mean nothing cute or funny about that. Mr. Jenner was it. His imagining of the change was not an it because it hadn't been done. So to Parmenides, all of this idea of changing was not only something we couldn't think about accurately or maybe even at all, but it was just an illusion because we could not think about it. To think of change would require us to think of something in terms of what is not, because it's not here. It hasn't happened. For Parmenides, not only can something not come out of nothing, but also something cannot arise out of being. Okay? What do I mean by that? If something arises out of being, it already is. The law of non-contradiction declares that something cannot be what it is and what it is not at the same time and in the same relationship. In other words, if something is already here, it can't become something else and be it at the same time and in the same relationship. It's important to note, however, that Parmenides was apparently attacking not only the absurd notion of self-creation, which is what he was getting at, the ex nihilo, post nihilo. This box could not create itself. It had to be created. He was not only arguing against that, self-creation, which is absurd, but also any notion of creation, which by implication Parmenides would have thought the Christian or Jewish or Muslim idea of a creator God to be also absurd. Now, we don't, the Christian idea, and indeed even the Muslim or Jewish idea of God and creation does not include any craziness like self-creation, but it's nevertheless not without difficulties, and it's been being argued for, well, forever, or at least 2,500 years. And we will mention some of that in our study as well. The impasse on the matter of change, and this is where you may come in, where you stand on this whole subject. The impasse about change, or the argument between becoming and being, actually led or provoked the rise of skepticism. Just like many people today believe, look, there's no answer to this stuff. There's no answer to this argument about being and becoming, and you can't step in the same river twice. It's a waste of my time. It's silly. And for a long time, skeptics pretty much ruled the philosophical field because they believed that trying to uncover the answers to some of these questions was a fool's errand. And to wrap up tonight, we're going to talk about a fellow named Zeno. Let's see, of Elea. Elea was a city in Italy, and he was a student of Parmenides. Parmenides had opened a school in that town. He wanted to defend Parmenides, his teacher. There were critics of Parmenides who cited something that we also don't know a lot about today, I don't think, common sense. His critics cited common sense. So, sense perception in their argument proves the existence or the reality of things. I know this whiteboard is here because I knocked an eraser off of it. I've been writing on it, and I can feel it. I can see it. If I had any desire to, I could probably taste it, but I'm going to pass on that one. They argued that our experiential, or our experiences in life through our senses prove the reality of things. But Zeno came up with 4 paradoxes that argued against the infallibility of our senses. Now, we now, for the most part, or at least reasonable people, recognize that our senses can be tricked, but we still rely heavily on our senses to determine what something is, whether it's real or not, whether it's hard, soft, hot, cold, whatever the case may be. But Zeno said the senses deal only with the appearance of reality. You may think something is real through your senses, but you can be tricked. And he used these 4 paradoxes, and one of them was Zeno set forth an argument that said, he used the illustration of a racetrack. There's a racetrack. And you can imagine a foot race, chariot races, NASCAR, whatever you want. But let's use a runner, a human runner. To circle the track, the runner must traverse an infinite number of points. In other words, this track, this line, this circle is made up of an infinite number of points. And you must traverse each one in a finite number of moments. Okay? So you have to traverse an infinite number of points in a finite amount of time. The runner would first need to reach the halfway point. Then from there, he would have to go halfway to the end. And then another halfway. And then another halfway. And so on and so forth, into an infinite number of halfways, never reaching the finish line. Now, I will tell you that this was a fascinating paradox, but of course, a racetrack, a finite track, cannot hold an infinite number of points. So Zeno was a little in error when he postulated this to the critics of Parmenides, but nonetheless, that was what he said about how deceptive things can be to the senses. Another of his paradoxes was a race between Achilles and a tortoise. Now, some of you may remember, if you've watched, even if you don't remember your Homer, but if you watch the movie Troy or anything like that, you remember that Achilles was the fleet-footed warrior, with the only part that could cause him to be killed being his Achilles heel, now called the Achilles heel. But in any event, a race between Achilles and the tortoise. And to be fair, Achilles gave the poor tortoise, who was going to get spanked in this race, he gave the poor tortoise a head start. Okay? To beat the tortoise, Achilles must first catch up to where the tortoise is when Achilles leaves his position. The process Achilles must go halfway, then another halfway, then another halfway. The same scenario as the racetrack. The process continues forever, so that Achilles is always chasing the tortoise but never catching him. Again, we experience the falsehood of these paradoxes, but we cannot explain how they are not true. The third paradox, I'm not going to go through all these, I'm going to stop here in a second. The third paradox involves an archer and an arrow. Pardon my silly looking bow and arrow. An arrow in flight must always occupy a space equal to its length. So as the arrow travels, it's going to be taking up that much space as it's in flight. But for an arrow to occupy a space equal to its length, at that moment, it must be at rest. In other words, as this 2-foot-long arrow is traveling, after it's been fired, is traveling through the air, it must fill a 2-foot spot along the arc of its travel. However, for it to fill that 2-foot arc, to actually fill it, the arrow must be at rest. Since the arrow always occupies a space equal to its length, it must be at rest. Therefore, the travel of the arrow is an illusion, because it must fill that 2 feet of space. It can only be known to fill that 2 feet of space if it's at rest, but once it's been fired, it's in motion. But the motion must be an illusion. Thus taught Zeno. The last paradox involved motion, and we're not ready to talk about motion yet, so we're going to leave it at that. We're going to leave it at that for tonight, and we will pick up again next week. I'm very hopeful that this has been of interest to you. I assure you, in a week or so, we're going to be out of the ancients into more modern ideas that have pushed along. But the important thing to remember is that this is all a foundation. There are blocks, Thales, Heraclitus, Parmenides, and the others that we're going to talk about briefly, are all building blocks for the foundation that ultimately gets us where we are today. All of these people had a say in what we think, do, and believe in the 21st century. So what I'm just trying to do here is give you the basics of this foundation, and to remember when we get to what has been going on in the last several hundred years and today, you'll remember that these men shaped it 2,600 years ago. Thank you for being here tonight, and we will close, as always, with a word of prayer. Lord, thank you for the knowledge that you give us, and that you have given us down through the centuries, and also the things that have misled men because of their fallenness. Men who lived in a society on the 1,000 miles away from the origination of or the knowledge of people that understood sin, though they oftentimes acted like they did not. Please help us to realize how, as we go along, these ideas formed us, formed our society, actually led to the condition of the world as it is today. In Jesus' name, amen.